Welcome to the Shema podcast series, The Sages of the Talmud with Morty Roth, a timeless journey into the lives behind the lines of the Gemara, their stories, their struggles, our heritage. Before the ink of the Mishnah ever touched parchment, the Torah lived on lips, not pages. The sages were the scrolls, their minds the parchment, their hearts the ink. It was passed, not published, from teacher to student, across centuries of exile, fire, and faith. This is the story of the men who kept Torah alive for us, the Talmudic sages, whose voices echo through every daf. And guiding us on this journey will be Morty Roth, and with clarity, depth, and warmth, Morty brings to life the great figures of our tradition, not only through their teachings, but through their character, their stories, and the spiritual imprint they left behind. Morty, welcome to the show. I am so excited about this new series and your willingness to undertake this project for us. You know, it came about from two things happening simultaneously. One is there was a request in the Shema podcast WhatsApp community to get a background on Rabbi Akiva and a lot of the other Talmudic sages, what we could learn about them. And at the same time, one of the highlights of my life now is our daily study. Morty has agreed to be my charusa and teach me. I'm so excited about that. And one of the things Morty has always stressed is making sure I understand who is engaged in the debate, what their background is, what period they come from, and help me understand the person behind the argument and the position. Morty, thank you for doing this for us as a series and getting started today with Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi.
Thank you very much for this singular privilege, really, to be able to speak on a topic that is, at first blush, perhaps not so relevant today, because this is something that occurred, at least in the case of Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi, Judah the Prince, the redactor of the first ever written word of the oral law so many, many years ago. But the fact of the matter is that the origins of the Mishnah and the personality of Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi are indeed very, very relevant to us today. So thank you very much for this opportunity. And with your kind permission, I will just dedicate this, if I may, to, of course, the hostages that are still being held. It's a terrible situation. In recent days, we've witnessed some very disturbing photographs and videos, in particular of one of the hostages who was literally skin and bones, and he's being forced to dig his own grave. It's just a horrifying scene. So I want to dedicate to these men and women that are still held captive, and the hopes that, God willing, their ordeal and the ordeal for Israel and all of us around the world will end soon. In addition, there was a horrible event that I'm sure you're aware of that occurred in New York less than 2 weeks ago, or about 2 weeks ago, where a number of people were shot in a Manhattan office building, and two of the victims were Jewish women. And one of them was named Wesley Lapatner. Her Hebrew name was Michal Ziva Bas Arya Leib, and she was employed as a very senior executive at the Blackstone Group, which is very, very successful and worldwide investment firm, and she was in charge of all of the real estate. Billions of dollars she was responsible for, and she was a member of a congregation on the east side of New York. She was a mom. She was involved in very, very many different charities in New York, including the Federation, among other things, that she was very active. And she was taken from us, and she was all of 43 years old. Terribly tragic. Along with her, at the same time, not in the same exact place, but in a different part of the building, a young lady named Julia Hyman. I don't have her Hebrew name, but she worked for something called Rudin, R-U-D-I-N Management, which is a large and old New York real estate firm. When I was a banker in my earlier days, we did some business with the Rudin family. She was employed there. She was a fairly recent graduate of Cornell. She was all of 26 years old. So, Zechronim Levrach Hashem Yikum Damam. And Hashem Yisbarach, God Almighty, Hashem should take his proper revenge on all those who are happy at such events. We certainly are not. And we remember them just as we remember all other people who need help in this time.
Amen, Morty. Thank you so much for that dedication. So Where do we begin this story? Because there's obviously a lot, not only unraveling who Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi was, but the background and the circumstances surrounding this pivotal decision to redact and write down the Mishnah Torah.
So the beginnings, actually, as one might expect, because in Judaism, we almost have nothing that is brief. Brevity is not one of our characteristics. So if we speak about Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi, his background and the times, the context of his era, we do have to go back a bit, because that will help explain to a degree why he felt the imperative to begin to write things down that had never been written down before, at least not in a formal manner. So let's begin with the times that he lived in and just a little bit before then. There were difficult times for the Jewish people before the destruction of the temple, of the second temple. The Jewish people who were primarily at that time located in the land of Israel, of course, had the temple, and we were subjugated by the Romans. And the Romans did some pretty harsh things. Perhaps one of the most vicious of the Roman emperors was someone named Hadrian, which in the Talmud is called Andrinus. But Hadrian, aside from being wicked, was a very effective manager. He knew what he wanted, and he restricted the Jewish people in great form. And through the Roman Senate, they passed a number of edicts which restricted not only the movements of the Jewish people in Israel, but also their ability culturally to function as Jews. One of those edicts involved something called smicha. Smicha, of course, is a term that refers generally to one of two things. There's smicha when we go and we bring a sacrifice in the Holy Temple, in the Bet HaMikdash, we would lay our hands on the sacrifice, on the sacrifice's head. That was a form of smicha. But that's not the smicha we're speaking of here. We're speaking of smicha, which means the generational passing down of the ability to teach. The ability to teach, the license to teach was not a given. You had to earn it by way of a series of examinations and typical type of Torah behavior. And as a result of that, you were then recommended for smicha. You went through the examinations, and then you got smicha, which was the passing down of the ability and the licensure to continue to teach. So the Romans wanted to put an end to this because they understood that the war with the Jews, which would not become a war until much later, was just subjugation. But the war with the Jews was not with the Jews themselves in terms of the, let's call it the proletariat or the average Jew. The war really was with the leaders of the Jewish people, the rabbis. And if they could get to the rabbis and restrict the rabbis and make their lives difficult, then it would, by definition, make it difficult for the Jewish population to function as Jews. So what they did was they enacted an edict that this passing down of the smicha, which was a guarantee, as long as it continued, that the Torah would be passed down from generation to generation, they put a stop to that, or they wanted to put a stop to that. So they made a very, very harsh edict, which said that if anyone is caught giving smicha to another person, then they would both be killed. The area in which it happened, there would be a great deal of punishment for them, meaning there would be high taxes that would be imposed on that area. Many people would be banished, and so on and so forth. There was just almost no end to the viciousness of this particular edict. So what did one gentleman do? His name was Rabbi Yehuda ben Bava. He was a Tana. He was one of the early Talmudists. He took 5 of his students and he brought them into Judean desert. And in the Judean desert, he found a spot that was neither in one municipality or another. It was on the border, so that if they measured from one to the other, they would not be able to find a specific spot to punish. And he did this in the hills. Unfortunately, as has been true for most of Jewish history, and certainly is true today as well, there were informers. And these informers told the Romans what was being planned by Rabbi Yehuda ben Bava and with these 5 students. And so they followed them into the desert. And as this was unfolding, they attacked. As soon as Rabbi Yehuda ben Bava saw what was occurring, he asked his students to run. And they did run, and they all survived. But he, according to the Talmud, was hit with literally scores, if not hundreds, of spears. And that's the death that he suffered. Among those Talmidim, among those disciples, was Rabbi Meir. Rabbi Meir, who was also called sometimes in the Talmud Rabbi Naharoi, which means the one who has light. And he, Rabbi Meir, who we'll discuss only briefly because we just have almost so much time, but he was the main teacher or rabbi of Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi, of Rabbi Judah the Prince, the redactor of the Mishnah.
A few questions, Morty. Was the reason for positioning himself between the two cities so that the blame would not fall on a particular city?
Exactly. Yes.
And also, did the Romans sort of know the spiritual power of Torah, and that if they stopped it from being passed on to the next generation, that was our biggest and only really Achilles heel?
Yes. We need to understand who the Romans were. The Romans, if you look at architecture as just one example, right? The aqueducts, the ability to deliver water over many, many miles and so forth, the publication of certain books, the debates within the Senate, the laws that were promulgated in Rome, and that they were able to control an empire that was huge. All of these things point to a people who were not fools, and they were very, very capable, unfortunately. And in this particular regard, they knew what the Jewish people represented, and they also understood that scholarship was at the heart of the Jews' survival. Education to this day is one of the most important elements in all of Jewish life, of course. So yes, they knew the value, and that's why I said a moment earlier that they targeted the rabbis for that very reason. They figured if they can cut off the educational funnel, if you will, then they would be successful in bringing an end to all of it. God forbid. So yes, that was the plan.
Wow. Okay.
So in any case, so this Rabbi Meir was one of these survivors, and he was the main rabbi of Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi. And just a word about who Rabbi Meir is and what his place is in Jewish history. He is one of the most illustrious people that we have in our history. He's not discussed a great deal, but he is enigmatic, he is charismatic, and he has unbelievable parts to his history. So he is believed to come from proselytes, meaning that one of the rulers of Rome is believed to be one of the Neros, probably the Nero that is famous for having fiddled while Rome burned, that Nero, who came to Jerusalem looking for a fight. But when he got here, this Nero, things happened. We don't go into the details right now, but he approached Jerusalem and he shot an arrow, because sometimes they would use an arrow and see where it went and what its distance was and what its trajectory was to get an idea of what was in store for them. They were, in some ways, very superstitious. And being superstitious leads you to those things. But in any case, based on what happened when he shot the arrows, Nero turned around. And according to some, he became a Jew. He converted. And one of his grandchildren was Rabbi Meir. So this Rabbi Meir had a teacher, which I think we discussed once during our learning, by the name of Elisha ben Avuya, who left the fold, and still Rabbi Meir was loyal to him and stayed with him. Rabbi Meir is also a person who was referred to as Rabbi Meir Baal Hanes, the master of miracles, because of certain things that happened to him in his life. Very quickly, the story is he was married to a woman that was equal in knowledge to some of the major Talmudists. His wife's name was Bruria, and this Bruria knew as much Talmud as many of the men of her time. And they had an interesting life because they had tragedy in their life. They lost 2 sons, for instance, but she was a very, very bright woman. One day, under the Romans, her sister, Rabbi Meir's sister-in-law, was taken captive by the Romans. And she was put into a house of ill repute where they wanted to use her for the Roman troops. Bruria pled with her husband. She pleaded with him, said, you have to get her out. So he thought about it, and he went on his way, and he went to get her out. And she had been there only a matter of a day or two, as it turns out. But he went in, disguised, and they asked him what his business was, and he said he wanted to partake of what there is there. And he asked for her specifically. So they brought her to him, and no matter how hard he tried, he could not convince her to be with him, to partake of this terrible act that they had brought her in for. So from that, he understood that she had not been contaminated, that she had withstood the pressure, even in those few days that she was there. So he knew that she was spiritually safe. So what happened was that he approached the guard, and he said to the guard, listen, I will pay you to let her go. I'll take her into my responsibility. He says that I'd be glad to take your money, but when they come here once a month to do a count, they're going to see that there's one missing, and I will have to pay with my life. So, and this guy said, listen, and I have these two dogs here. There were two huge dogs that he had trained, and that anybody who did anything that was against the rules of the house, let's call it, these dogs would attack. And he himself had seen this guard at the place, had seen the results of these two dogs attacking people. So Reb Meir said to him, I guarantee you that nothing will happen to you. He said, just try to release the dogs on me, which he did. And Reb Meir said the famous line, which is repeated by many people that are in trouble, Elakah de Meir Anena, the God of Meir, answer. And then at that moment, those two dogs fell away, and Reb Meir was able to continue. So this man saw what happened. So he said to Reb Meir, okay, I'm in agreement then, we'll do this. But what happens when these guys come? What am I supposed to do? He says, repeat what I'm teaching you now, these words, and everything will be okay. And indeed, that's what happened. The Gemara relates to us that indeed at the end of the month they came, they did a count, they saw that they were short, and they wanted to attack him. And he used those words, and he was left alone, and he too converted. So this is an idea of the caliber of who we're dealing with. In the end of his life, Reb Meir left Israel, and he, even though to this day there is a gravesite in Tiberias that is considered to be his gravesite, and literally tens of thousands of people come every year to pray there. And there are many, many charities that are named after Reb Meir. They're called Reb Meir Balanes, and they're from different organizations that are spread throughout. They used to be mostly in Europe, but today they're in Israel and America. But he himself is believed, really, according to many people, to be buried on the shores of Turkey. And he asked to be buried on the shore in Turkey, near the water, so that the waters, because the waters of Turkey that are on the coast of Turkey are the Mediterranean. So they actually kiss the shore of Israel as well. So he felt that he'd still have a connection to Israel. How he ended up there and so forth, that's all something that will be perhaps in another time, but we have to get on with what we're discussing. So I mentioned Rabbi Meir to give you an understanding of who this personality was, and that he was the main teacher. I say the main teacher because he was not the only teacher, but the main one of Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi, or someone we refer to sometimes as Rabbeinu HaKadosh, our holy rabbi. So Reb Meir and his compatriots and his contemporaries, which would include people like Rabbi Akiva and others, made a series of notes over the years, which became the oral law, meaning there are prohibitions against writing down the oral law. The oral law was given to Moses, given to Moshe Rabbeinu, at the same time that the written law was given to him. However, the oral law was meant to be studied only orally. What happened over time, though, is that we have a general rule, which means that the generations get weaker. Niskatna hadars, that the generations get weaker. Our intellectual capacity, even though we have some very, very bright people today, obviously, and throughout the years and throughout the generations, but the fact of the matter is the scholarly capacity of our minds doesn't come to the feet of what it was in the times of the Talmud. So Rabbeinu HaKadosh looked around and he saw that this was occurring, and he borrowed a phrase that appears in Psalms, which says, Eis lasas Lashem heferu Torasecha. It has reached the point where your Torah, God, your law is going to be forgotten, God forbid. So he took these notes, which included those from Reb Meir and Rabbi Akiva and a bunch of others that were contemporaneous, and he began to organize them. They were organized into different categories, but they were not redacted, they were not edited, they were a bit haphazard. He put them into a form which became what we call the Mishnah. And the word Mishnah, by the way, means repetition or repeating, or studying again. So he took all of these various opinions, because there were opinions, a lot of different opinions that were being disputed and argued in the Mishnah. And I'll give you a formal definition of Mishnah that appears in one of the books, which, by the way, people who are interested, after they listen to the podcast, if they want further references, where to go to get more information or to follow up on some of these discussions or get more of a background, a fuller background on some of what we're discussing, I'm happy to supply a bibliography after we're done, if need to, if anybody's interested.
That would be great. We can put that in the show notes, Morty. Also, can you share with the audience that there, from my understanding, a verse in the Torah that alludes to this idea that the oral Torah should not be written down, but yet there's another verse in the Torah that says, in order to preserve Torah, the Torah needs to be, laws need to be changed, something like that. Because I know this was very controversial at the time, this idea of actually taking what was just manuscripts and notes and actually putting it into a formalized text.
Yes. Again, because of the fact that it was, we believe, passed down to Moshe Rabbeinu, to our teacher Moses, as a oral teaching that was supposed to last throughout the generations, that would be oral. Initially, we based the prohibition against writing on words that appear in the Torah that say, Al pi hadvarim ha'ela, according to these words, karati imachem bris, I made with you a covenant. These words, we believe, according to the Talmud, refer to the oral law. And that as a result of that, we're not supposed to write them down because of that verse. In the continuation, according to the Talmud, is Devarim sheba peh I atar lechaisvam, words that are oral you're not permitted to teach. Torah shebeksav I atar l'amrim bal peh. And on the other hand, conversely, those words that are written, which are the 5 books of Moses, you're not supposed to use orally unless you have a very good reason to do so. Meaning that you can't just, that's why some people, for instance, today, we have many songs that use verses from the Torah. And it's a bit controversial. Some people don't like that because it kind of trivializes the words, the holy words of the 5 books of Moses. So that is the source of why we believe that we can't put into writing what is oral law. But again, Rabbeinu HaKadosh, seeing what was going on, asked other members of his entourage, if you will. They discussed this, and they came to the conclusion that to save the oral law, they must do this. So again, there were these notes which were organized, but not put into a form that was easily followed. So Rabbeinu HaKadosh put it into a format that was easy to follow, and he made 6 different categories. You can stop me at any point, interrupt me in any way you like, of course, but I just want to give you some definitions before we get into it, all right? So one of the words that we come across, of course, Mishnah, as I told you, means to repeat or repetition or to learn again or even to teach. There is another word that is similar to it, that is Aramaic, which means or is pronounced masnisa, masnita or masnita, which is essentially the Aramaic version of Mishnah. And it too refers to Mishnah. Then there is a word which we've come across many times in our learning, which is called Braisa. Braisa is essentially referred to, it means the extraneous one, meaning that this is it's actually a generic catch-all phrase for those Mishnahs which Rabbeinu HaKadosh, Rabbi Yehuda the Prince, did not put into the Mishnah, not because he didn't want to, but because it would have been just too voluminous. There were thousands of Braisas as well. However, the Braisa is almost the equivalent of the Mishnah, even though it doesn't appear in the Mishnah, because we use it, as you know from our learning, we use it sometimes, we quote Braisas, we quote complete Braisas, sometimes just a line from a Braisa, because we use it for comparative purposes, or to make a proof, or to ask a question of a Mishnah. So Braisas are terribly important, and that too is part of Talmud. The word Gemara, which many people will be familiar with, Gemara is the easiest way to understand that is that if you take open up a volume of the Talmud, you will see in the Babylonian Talmud that you have a Mishnah, and that is, by the way, in Hebrew. And then the Mishnah is followed by the Gemara, which is a discussion of, it's a dialogue. It's a discussion of the Mishnah where it's thrashed out. What did the Mishnah mean? Who took this position? Who took that position? And why? What's their reasoning? So the Gemara is referred to as that part which follows the Mishnah, and the word Gemara actually means complete or to complete. So the completion of the Talmud is the Gemara because it's taking the Mishnah, which is the formulation for the Talmud, and explaining it and drawing conclusions about what the Mishnah means and what it's saying. So that's Gemara. It's what Talmud itself means, which is, of course, means to study or the act of studying. That's what Talmud means. Just three more brief definitions so we understand what the context is. Midrash. Midrash is something that is very often allegorical. It's stories, it's proverbs, it's filling out what some of the history was during the Talmud and a little bit after, and also giving us further details about some of the great personalities in Midrash. And Midrash means basically, it's in post-biblical Hebrew, to search out, to look for a scriptural passage and expound on it. Then there is halacha, which means to go or to follow. It comes from the word holech, going, walking or going. And that is, figuratively speaking, teaching what one should follow or how one should follow the law. Lastly, we have a category that's called Haggadah or Aggadata, and that is part of the Talmud, which is interwoven into the Gemara. Rarely is it in the Mishnah, but most of the time it's in the Gemara itself, and it means storytelling, proverbs, things of that nature. It's non-halachic. You might refer to it as homiletics, and it's very, 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 very important to the Talmud. And throughout the ages, we've come to the conclusion that there are many instances where the Aggadata or the Haggadah is not clear to us. Sometimes it's because the exaggeration seems to be just too much, or sometimes the events that are described seem beyond our understanding. But Aggadata is a very, very integral and important part of the Talmud.
Is it very similar to Midrash in the fact that it's sort of a combination of facts and metaphors?
Yes. And the Talmud very often will refer to some of these parts of the other parts of the Talmud, so to speak. And it's more prevalent in the Babylonian Talmud than it is in the Jerusalem Talmud, but there is enough in the Jerusalem Talmud as well. So please go ahead if you had another question.
Yeah, I just wanted to, before we move on, for myself and for the audience, to understand that this idea that what we had in place for so long was a combination of a written Torah and an oral Torah that was transmitted. Because, and I think it's easy to understand because a lot of people, you sort of naturally think that if you want to preserve something, then write it down. But the written word can be misread or things can be read into it. Like a perfect example is if you were to get the founding fathers of the Constitution in this country and resurrect them and have them look at the U.S. government today, they'd be like, well, this is not at all what we had spelled out in the U.S. Constitution, right? Because that was just 225 years ago of written document, but people read things into it. So there's this beautiful balance, I would say, you can comment on this, between having an oral, having a written. And even though we do have a Talmud now written out, it's based off a study of teacher and student still to this day. And it's based off a back and forth dialogue to preserve that oral tradition. Is that sort of an accurate assessment, or would you add or change anything to what I just said, Morty?
No, I think that's very well put. And it's exactly on the mark, because if we look at the format of the Gemara in terms of how it deals with the Mishnah, it does exactly that. It debates it. There are disputes, some of which are incredible in terms of their depth and in terms of their tenacity. We learned a piece of Gemara just a few days ago where there were 5 or 6 different attempts to change someone's position. You may recall, and in the end, they came to some agreement on it. But the fact of the matter is that yes, by way of dialogue, it's incredible to think about this. We're talking about thousands and thousands of pages, which it takes 7.5 years' time just for the Babylonian Talmud, one folio at a time, one two-sided page at a time, takes 7.5 years to complete. And each one of those pages is replete with these debates, with these arguments, with these references, and the full thought process of some of the brightest of the Jewish people. And that has come down to us. And much more importantly, we would not have survived without it. You have to consider what the Jewish world looked like at the time of Hadrian, at the time of the death a little later of Rabbi Akiva, at the time of the Bar Kokhba revolt, which was unsuccessful, which was a war against Rome, and the viciousness with which the Roman Empire came down on the Jewish people. And we would not have survived had not Rabbi Yehuda the Prince made that decision, that fateful decision, to begin to write this down. And this format, which he himself did not invent, that came later. The Mishnah is what he put together. He is the editor of that, and he gets the credit for that. But the Gemara, which is the dialogue that you were referring to, that dialogue, which saved us, basically, was actually completed roughly in the year 450 of the Common Era. And the final redactors of that were two people called Ravina, Ravina in English, and Rav Ashi, Ashi. Those two were the final redactors of the Talmud as we see it today, although there were some emendations that followed through the period of what was called the Rabbanan Savaroi, or the thinking rabbis, or the postulating rabbis, who made obvious changes, and the changes that needed to be made, because, again, we have to keep this in mind whenever we talk about anything that about the 1500s. Everything was kisvaya. There were manuscripts. Everything was done by hand. It's incredible that this survived. So they were careful to do that, and the Rabbanan Savaroi thrashed that out to be certain that that was as correct as it could be. They were followed by a period called the Gaonim. There are some very famous Gaonim like the Sadja Gaon, Rab Hai Gaon, others like that, which were responsible. We can do that another time, talk about them as well. But everyone played a part in bringing about what we have today in terms of what the Talmud is. I will mention to you one other thing that is important to understand about oral law. In addition to the oral law, as we discussed it in terms of its entire composition of what the oral law is, there is an element of the oral law that we speak of sometimes when we're learning, whether it's in Talmud or even when we're learning 5 books of Moses, which is referred to as halacha l'Moshe misinai. That is, something is accepted as being the truth and being what we have to accept based on the fact that this was given or passed on to Moses on Har Sinai when he was up there for the 40 days and 40 nights. And that's not necessarily something that you'll find in the Gemara, although there are discussions. But the fact of the matter is, some things are not, we don't have background for them, but we know that this is what has come down to us through the ages, that this is something that was given to Moses and it's a strict rule. So again, that's halacha l'Moshe Sinai, and that is also oral law.
Got it. Beautiful. Okay. So the year we're talking about right now with Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi, this is around, you said 200 Common Era?
A little earlier. It's about 160 to 200, somewhere in that range, 40 or 50 years.
And Second Temple has been destroyed.
At that point is gone. The Second Temple was destroyed in about the year 67 to 70, somewhere about there. So in the first century. And Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi was just post that. Rabbi Akiva was still alive when the temple was standing, of course, and many of his compatriots were. It's also interesting to note who some of the people were in different generations, because many people are familiar with certain names. So if I may, if you want to do this a little bit later, that's fine, but I was just going to give you an idea of the generations. If we deal with the Talmudists, as we know them as Tanoim, these would be the people that are mentioned in or helped write or took the notes to make what eventually became the Mishnah. Those are Tanoim. So the Tanoim, the very first ones, and by the way, before the word Tanoim, there was something called Zugos, or the pairs, like Shmaya and Aftalion, who were proselytes themselves. They came into the religion, but they were so advanced by the time they were finished that they were referred to as Zugos, one of the Zugos, and they were the beginning of the oral law that led into this period that we're talking about, that we're discussing now. But after that came the Tanoim, and the Tanoim, the very earliest ones, are Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai and the people of his generation. Briefly, very briefly, who some of these people were. Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai is the one who was alive during the destruction of the Second Temple. Very famously, the Gemara tells us in the Gemara in Gittin, where we discuss the destruction of the Second Temple and the events of that time, he's the one who was snuck out. He was spirited out of the city of Jerusalem, the walled city of Jerusalem, and he was brought to the Roman emperor. And he asked for several things, which included, among them was saving all the sages of that time, which eventually they went to Yavna under Rabbi Gamliel. He also asked for saving the life of Rabbi Tzadok, who was a gentleman who had been fasting every day, not at night, he ate at night, but every day for 40 years. Rabbi Tzadok, who was a huge tzaddik. In any case, that's who Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai was. Obviously, he was among the first Tanoim. The next generation, second generation of Tanoim, was Rabbi Gamliel of Yavna. He was the one who succeeded Rabbi Yochanan. And then we also have in that same generation, Rabbi Elazar and Rabbi Yeshua, who were two of the greatest Tanoim, and they would be what we call Balei Plukta. They would dispute amongst themselves very, very often. Two of the people who appear most in Shas are Rabbi Elazar and Rabbi Yeshua. Many, many stories about both of them, But again, we were limited on time for this now, so we'll just go through the generations. The third generation was Rabbi Akiva. So Rabbi Akiva is the third generation of the Tanoim. And again, his period ends at about 135 of the Common Era. The fourth generation is the one that we were just discussing, which is Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Yehuda. Those were the fourth generation. Our generation that we're discussing mostly today, which is Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi, that is the fifth generation. The last generation of Amoraim, which is we won't call it the sixth generation because it's really a generation that straddles both the Amoraim and the Tanoim, is the generation that actually had someone called Rav. And Rav is referred to as Rav Tana Upalig. Rav, he was really an Amora more than a Tana, but he's given the moniker of one who can argue in a Mishnah because of the position that he has between those generations. The first generation of Amoraim included Rabbi Chanina, Rabbi Osher. These were in Israel. And then we're already beginning to talk about Babylon and Bavel, and that's Rav and Shmuel, same, they're the first generation. The second generation is Rabbi Yochanan, not to be confused with Rabbi Yochanan and Zakkai. This is Rabbi Yochanan, the Amora, and he is in Babylon already, and along with him is Rish Lakish. And you remember that we discussed Rabbi Yochanan Rish Lakish. Rish Lakish is a brother-in-law of Rabbi Yochanan. He brought him into the fold. Rabbi Rish Lakish was actually, according to the Gemara, he was a gladiator before he became religious. And he worked his way up to become an Amora, incredible, one of the members of the Gemara. Rav Huna and Rabbi Yehuda are also part of that generation. The third generation is Rabami and Ravasi and Rab Zera and Rabbi Yosef. The fourth generation is Rabbi Yonah and Rabbi Yossi. Rabbi Yossi is a big person as well. And then famously, the fourth generation includes Abaya and Rava. Also, perhaps the two most mentioned people in all of the Talmud in Gemara is Abaya and Rava, who have a great number of disputes, of which Abaya, we go according to his ruling only 6 times. Out of the many, many times that they have arguments or disputes, only 6 times do we rule like Abaya, but they were incredible, the two of them together. The fifth generation was Rabbi Yossi, Rav Papa, who had 10 sons. And we mention Rav Papa and his 10 sons each time we do a siyum. Each time we do a siyum, when we finish a tractate, we have a certain language before we say a Kaddish. And in there, we mention the 10 sons of Rav Papa because they were extraordinary in terms of their erudition and their fidelity to the Talmud. The fifth door is Rav Ashi, who we just spoke about, as being one of the final redactors of the Gemara. And the seventh generation is Ma'abar Rav Ashi, also important in the closing of the Talmud. And the last door, which is the eighth door, is Ravina, the last Ravina, and Rabbi Yossi. These are the people who, again, these few generations, primarily Ravina and Rav Ashi, who actually closed the Talmud and put it into its present form. One last note on what is in the Talmud and what is not. There is a book that is called Chesronos Hashas, which translates into the missing parts of the Talmud. That refers to items that were either self-censored, that we as Jews at that generation, we took it out because of the fact that of the sensitivity, because that time, of course, was a time of the growth of the Christian religion and how it came to be and what that meant for us and some of the great difficulties involved for the Jewish people when that was happening. So certain Gemaras that relate to that history and to some of the personalities, including Jesus himself, were removed from the Gemaras. We know what some of them are. We don't have all of it, but we have some of them, and they are available to be studied separately in what I call, as I said, the Chesronos Hashas is one of them. So there was self-censoring, and then there was censoring by the church, where they took out some pieces of the Gemara deliberately because it didn't jive with their view of theology.
Right. I thought those are not inserted back now into the standard.
Some of them are, yes, some of them are. But you will never, I shouldn't say never, but in Aramaic, Jesus is referred to as Yesha HaNotzri, Jesus of Nazareth, or Jesus the Nazarite. So you rarely find him referred to directly. Most of the time, he's referred to as Oisai Huish, that man. So we're still very careful with it, but yes, a lot of it is back and has been reinserted.
Gotcha. And my understanding too that where that text was extracted from the Talmud, that page would be left blank. So we sort of knew where it was being
Yeah,
carved out from.
yes, not in all editions, but yes, certainly in most of the editions that are in our hands today and that are based off what's called the Vilna Shas. Most of them are that way, yes. There are other books as well that were written about that time period, which were written in some cases fairly recently. When I say fairly recent, I'm talking within the last century. And there are others that were written prior to that try to do justice to what that period was like for us. It was not pleasant, that's for sure. You have to consider that the Romans originally were, they were pagans. They didn't believe in religion at all. And they gave us a hard time because of what we represented and the fact that from their perspective, we were a threat to their rule ultimately. But the fact of the matter is that when things began to turn, based primarily, by the way, on the salesmanship of someone who's known as Shaul HaTarshish, or Paul. He became known as Paul, the apostle. He was the great salesman for the Christian religion. And it was his traveling all over Asia Minor and parts of Southern Europe and so forth that was responsible for the emperor Constantine, ultimately in the year 313, adopting Christianity as the religion for the Roman Empire. And that in itself resulted in a great deal of trouble for us. So all of this plays into, again, why the putting down on paper of the oral law was very, very significant.
Great. Okay. So did Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi, were any of his contemporaries against this idea, or was everyone sort of on board that this was necessary at this point in time?
The overwhelming majority of the people who were his compatriots or contemporaries went along with this. There were notable exceptions, but we don't find a great deal of acrimony on the subject. There are other things that people disagreed with him on because he took a fair amount of power for himself, Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi did, but most understood because of the exigencies of time and what was going on around the Jewish world and the world around the Jewish world, that this was very, very much, if you want to refer to it as a problem, it was very, very necessary to do this, though. So to answer your question, there were some disagreements, but not significant enough, obviously, not material enough to have prevented it.
Yeah, I would like to understand a little more about his leadership. I understand he was a man of great wealth.
Yeah, he was very, very wealthy, so much so that the Talmud relates to us that there was never anything missing from his table, whether it was winter months or summer months, anything that you might not find usually during the winter, only in the summer, or vice versa, was always on his table. He was very, very wealthy. It was reputed, according to a line in the Talmud, according to some it's an exaggeration, but that the people who worked in his stables were wealthier than the kings of Persia. That's how wealthy he was, that his servants were that wealthy. He had this wealth and he used the wealth wisely. By that I mean that he initially opened up the storehouses of his food to anyone that was studying Torah. Eventually, one of the people who was a studier of the Torah pretended that he wasn't, and he came to look for food, and Rabbeinu HaKadosh wouldn't give him any because he hadn't studied anything. So he said, okay, well then give it to me just because I'm poor. And he got Rabbeinu HaKadosh, got him thinking, and he said to himself, you know what, this is probably not correct. And he opened up the storehouses to everyone. So you're talking about moments when there were great poverty, and he was responsible for feeding many, many people. But when he was about to leave the world, he lifted up his 10 fingers, he lifted up his hands, and he said to God, he said to Hashem, you know that these 10 fingers, these hands enjoyed nothing of what I was able to have in terms of material wealth. I gave all of it away. And that was true of him. Now, in terms of his leadership, he was, in addition to being wealthy, and this says a lot about him as a person as well, he was not at all, let's call it oblivious to what the plight of people were at that time, of his time. Meaning that because he understood that he had wealth, and because he understood what it meant not to have food and so forth, he changed some of the laws, not biblical laws, but some of the sanctions or some of the rules about the Shemitah year, about the 7th year, where the land has to be fallow and so forth. So there are lots of difficulties created, obviously, for poor people when the land is not being tilled and there's no harvest the way there is the other 6 years. So some of these difficulties were so terrible for poor people that he temporarily suspended them. He didn't do away with Shemitah. All right, so that again, that tells us a little bit about who he was in terms of his ability to take himself out of his own position and see the plight of others. And one of the ways that he did it, as I give an example, sometimes the rules of Maser, of what you're supposed to tithe, and the rules of what you're supposed to leave over on the field, and so on and so forth, he geographically drew lines that exempted some people from those laws, so that it made it easier for them to have more, to keep more of what they had, and so forth. So he was very, very sensitive, but he was tough. He didn't suffer fools, and he didn't suffer anyone that would in any way have challenged, not necessarily his authority, but would have challenged the benefits of some of the changes he was making. The changes that he made were not meant to be restrictive, or not meant to be in any way, to pay for things more than they should be costing, or anything else of that nature, but rather they were to make life easier in an era where sometimes life was quite difficult because of the fact of Roman rule. He was really quite an interesting person. One of the other things that is interesting about him, and that the Gemara spends some time on, is his relationship with one of the Roman emperors. There is a disagreement among some of the scholars about who the person was that he was really the closest to. Some say it was an emperor called Antonius Pius, and this Antonius Pius was the immediate successor to Hadrian. So people say that it was him. Others say no, it was actually someone called Marcus Aurelius, which is a name that we're quite familiar with in Roman history. And the relationship was so close that the Gemara tells us, the Talmud tells us, that there was a tunnel between their two homes. Now, we don't know how to understand this, because Rome to Israel would be quite a long tunnel. It might mean that when Marcus Aurelius would visit Israel, as he would from time to time, it might be that they had this tunnel between those two places. We don't know. There are differences of opinion about that, but they were so close that Marcus Aurelius would ask him questions about how to rule and what he should do about certain situations politically. One great example, politically or economically, one great example is he would send, whenever he didn't come or couldn't come to Israel, he would send messengers to Rabbi Yehuda, prince known as Rabbi Yehuda, and he would ask him certain questions related to affairs of the state. Once he sent him a message, and he said, "My coffers are getting empty. What should I do?" In other words, the royal treasury is getting low. What should I do? So Rabbeinu HaKodesh didn't answer him directly, because he knew that would not be a good idea. So he told the servant that he sent the messenger, so he took him to his fields in the back, and he told him to watch here for about 20 or 30 minutes, watch what's going on. And in the middle of that interval of time, they watched as a gentleman took some plants. In this case, it was radishes, actually, radishes and onions, pulled smaller ones out of the ground, and then he put larger ones in. And he did that all along a whole couple of furrows. And so the guy asks him, the messenger says to Rabbi Yehuda, Princess, what are you telling me here? He says, don't ask me any questions. Just repeat to the emperor what you saw here. And so the messenger goes back and he repeats, because he asks him, what did you see, or what were you told? He says, I wasn't told anything. Your master, your friend, took me out to the back and he had me watch the fields. And in the fields, I saw some uprooting of some plants being replaced by others. And so Marcus Aurelius, if that's the one who we're talking about, understood that meant that he should replace these people that were in his government. And indeed, he replaced the people, and the coffers were refilled. Obviously, they were stealing from the government. So this is the influence that he had, and this is the relationship he had with one of the emperors of Rome.
Is there any validity to the story? I think I've heard that he converted.
Yes, there is a belief, according to some, that he did convert. Yes, it's not universally accepted, but yes. In fact, there is a reference somewhere in the Gemara, I can't think of exactly where it is at the moment, but where he gave a gift to Rabbeinu HaKodesh. Sometimes the gifts were in the way of not a physical gift, but rather doing away with some of the bad laws or edicts that were where the Jews are suffering from. So sometimes that was a gift. But in any case, on one of these occasions, he gave something to Rabbeinu HaKodesh, and Rabbeinu HaKodesh picked up his arms and said, "Bless the God of Israel." He didn't say, "Bless our God." But in other places, he would say, bless our God. So according to people who study this, they believe when he said our God, he had indeed converted. And when he didn't say our God, it meant that he hadn't yet converted. He was still not a non-Jew, a Gentile.
Tell me if I remember this correctly, there was a story, I don't know where I heard it, I don't know where it's written, how both their mothers.
Yes, I know where you're going with this, with the circumcision.
Yeah, both their mothers, basically, when they were nursing them, had a interaction with each other early on in their lives.
Yes, it's a wonderful story. It's incredible, actually. It's just, you think about what a turn history would have taken had this not happened, had this story not happened. Essentially, one of we discussed earlier, of course, the many edicts that were promulgated and put on the Jewish people by the Romans, as they had been by other peoples as well, but by the Romans specifically. And one of those was they did not want circumcisions to take place for obvious reasons, what that represented and so forth. So word got around, though, that the father of Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi, which was from the family of, by the way, we'll get to his lineage in a minute. We should have done that at the beginning. Rabbeinu HaKadosh, so his father was Rabbi Gamliel, and rumor had it that he took his son, which was Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi, and he had him circumcised. So they were sending people to come to the home to examine the child. So they got wind of it. The family got wind of it. So the mother of Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi was very friendly with the father of one of the emperors, probably the one that he became friendly with, I believe, which was Marcus Aurelius. And she said, you know what? I have a boy and you have a boy. They're about the same age. Take my child, because you're almost certainly going to be brought for examination of your child. Take my child who is not circumcised, and you'll save the child's life. And that's what happened. They had the child brought to court, and they examined the child, and they saw that it was not circumcised. And that's how he came to be, that he was able to survive Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi. So that Gemara, Talmud, it's extraordinary. Now, one of the other things, when you were mentioning about that relationship and talking about how close they were, before he had actually, according to those who believe that he had, in fact, converted, Marcus Aurelius, according to another story, he asked Rabbi Yehuda, Prince, he asked Rabbeinu HaKadosh, am I going to survive and be in the world to come? And Rabbeinu HaKadosh promised him that he would, because of his activities, even before he converted, because of how friendly he was to the Jewish people and to him, that he would indeed see the world to come, which is incredible as well.
Amazing. And my understanding too, I don't know if when I heard someone tell over this story, was that there was obviously some spiritual influence that when Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi's mother was nursing the other child, I guess that had some major spiritual influence on him that caused him to pursue Torah learning at a later stage.
Absolutely. There's no question about that. And we believe, of course, in our faith and in Judaism, we believe that what we can consume in the way not only of intellectual consumption, but in terms of physical consumption, what we eat, what we drink, has an effect on us. And that's why non-kosher food is so anathema to us. And that's why sometimes we look at it and we can't even understand how someone would want to eat some of the things that they do. But yes, imbibing or eating of something that is of a holy nature or comes from a holy person will have an effect.
So talk about his lineage and a little more about his personality and other qualities and things that we can sort of get a good understanding of what went into the man that facilitated this significant event in Jewish history.
Yeah, he is, of course, one of the foremost personalities in our history as well. And having had a background where he had a Rebbe like Rebbe Meir, of course, the great person that he was, enigmatic as he might be. But the thing we need to remember about Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi's lineage is that he can claim lineage that went all the way back to King David. He was King David was an ancestor of his, and he came from a long line of what were called Nesiim, or leaders of Israel. In Babylon, there were also leaders of Israel, and they were called exilarchs. So he was the equivalent of that. He was a Nasi. His father was a Nasi. His grandfather was a Nasi. He came from Hillel HaNasi, the first one in Babylon, and Hillel HaNasi was also from the lineage from King David. So he traces his lineage all the way back, and he has a very illustrious family. Now, he himself Of course, we heard about his wealth. We heard about what a strong leader he was. But he had moments. He had moments where his personality was not warm. And an example that the Gemara gives us is there was once a calf that was about to be taken to be slaughtered. And I guess it understood that it was going to be slaughtered. So it ran under his robes to hide. And he looked down at it and he pulled it out from his robes and he says, I'm sorry, but you have to go because lakach neitzarta, because this is what you were born for. You were born for this. You have to go. And as a result of that, he was punished. He was actually punished. He got an illness later that he tied to this very event where he showed some callousness, some coldness. And that illness stayed with him for many years. It involved both his eyes, according to one part of the Gemara, and another part of the Gemara, it settled in his teeth. But he had a rough time because of it. But he accepted it. He accepted it. He understood why it happened. And again, this falls under the moniker of, and the heading of, that HaKadosh Baruch Hu, we learn sometimes, we know from the sages that HaKadosh Baruch Hu is exacting in terms of the behavior of righteous people, of saints, that if they do something wrong, he takes it out on them. He takes his measure of punishment out of them. And so even as great a personality as Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi suffered because of something that he had done that was not in character.
It seems so minor, but yet at the same time, the Almighty wants, for someone at his level, wants to take it out in this world, not Allah Abba.
Exactly.
So the smallest infraction ends up in a 2-year illness.
Full. Yes, exactly.
Right.
So that's one of the great stories of the Gemara, because again, one of the great things about Talmud as well is that it's not afraid to be honest. It's not afraid to tell us the pluses and the minuses. So, for instance, when we discuss Rebbe Meir, we learn about his Rebbe. His Rebbe was one of the great Tanoim, one of the great Talmudists. One of the things that he taught still survives in Ethics of the Father, which we discussed once, I believe, and that is when you write onto a scroll or a parchment that's been erased, it's not the same as when you write on a parchment that is brand new and has been treated. That's the difference between teaching an old person. That's the metaphor for teaching an older person Torah for the first time or teaching a young child. So that was the Rebbe of Rabbi Meir, and yet he left the fold. He became someone completely different because of 2 incidents. This was Elisha ben Avuya was his name. He's also referred to as Acher because they didn't want to use his name after a time. And again, we're mentioning this because this is the Rebbe or the teacher of Rabbi Meir, who was the teacher of Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi. So what happened to Elisha ben Avuya was that he saw once a person climbing on a tree, going out on a limb, and he was trying to perform the commandment, the mitzvah of Shiluach HaKan, sending away the mother from a nest. That we're permitted to take the eggs from a nest, but we first have to send the mother away. And if we do it that way, if we don't do it in the presence of the mother, but shoo her away, then we are promised long life. It's one of the 3 places in the Torah, in the 5 books of Moses, where we are promised long life if we observe the commandment properly. This is one of them, the Shluach HaKan. The other one is honoring our mother and our father. And the third one, which we will have in a few weeks in the laning and the parsha, is having honest weights and measures. Those are the 3 things. So he looks and he sees this man climbing out to do this commandment, to do this mitzvah of Shluach HaKan, sending the mother away. And as he's doing it, he falls from the tree limb and he dies. So he saw that. That's one incident. The other thing he saw was he saw his Rebbe, Rabbi Elisha ben Avuya's Rebbe, who's a person named Chutzpis HaMeturgemin. He was a person who read out loud what was being discussed. In other words, in those days, they didn't have microphone systems and they didn't have bullhorns, they had none of that. So to hear a shiur, sometimes there would be hundreds of people there, the Meturgemin would get up and he would, in a booming voice, repeat what the rabbi was saying. So this is a person obviously of a very high caliber. So this Chutzpis HaMeturgemin died in an awful way and his tongue was cut out. It was terrible, terrible. So he witnessed this as Elisha ben Avuya. Based on those 2 items that he witnessed, he says, I don't get it. In the case of the guy who is going to perform a mitzvah where the Torah promises us that we're going to get long life, and he dies. He dies right there in the middle of doing the mitzvah. How does that work? And the second one was his Rebbe, who was such a huge personality in Torah. He dies, and this is the way his body is treated. So for those 2 reasons, he left the fold. And he was afraid that he was never be forgiven. But in any case, again, this tells us a little bit about the caliber of people, the stature of the people that resulted in Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi.
Got it. Beautiful. To wrap up, Morty, what would you say are some personal lessons we can take from his life that we can apply to our own to strengthen our Torah learning, our observance, our just development as individuals?
I think what is perhaps the most salient feature of his life and the most profound and lasting legacy of Rabbeinu HaKadosh, Rabbi Yehuda the Prince, is the fact that he did what he felt he had to do in the face of some opposition, in the face of some risk, and also in the fact that he could not ultimately control what this would look like after his death and for the generations to come. He still felt, and he argued the case with himself, of course, and went through all of the pluses and minuses and came to the conclusion that he had to do this. And he had the courage to take a fundamental of our religion, of our faith, which is that you don't write down the oral law. And he said, I must do this to save my people and to save the generations that are yet to come. That he did that is such a great lesson for us. It teaches us that throughout the ages, and we know this to be true, whether it was through the Inquisition, or whether it was the Holocaust, or whether it was some of the really difficult times that Jews went through in Europe and other places around the world, it was this ability to say, I'm going to do what is right, regardless of what it costs me. Think about the number of people that went to their deaths saying Shema Yisrael, still believing to the very last moment, in the most horrific of moments, at the end of their lives, and some of them died in ways that are indescribable. We can't even use the words to discuss how some people died because they were Jews. And some of these people took their strength from someone like Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi, and they understood that if a person like him, of his stature, could come to the conclusion that he needed to do what he needed to do to save Am Yisrael, how much more so each of us as individuals have to understand what sacrifice means. We live in a world today that is in many ways scary. No question about it. We're coming towards the end of days. And Mashiach, God willing, will be here sooner than we can imagine, hopefully. But the fact of the matter is that we live in a world where we have been given every opportunity to study, to understand who we are, where we come from, what Judaism is, why we are considered to be a light unto the nations, and why that's a responsibility for us, not only in terms of how we live our lives individually, but how we do communally, and what our contributions to the attainment of the ultimate destiny of Am Yisrael is, and how responsible we need to be. So the lesson from Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi is, do what you need to do. Yes, ask for guidance if you need it. Think it through. Ask others who are knowledgeable and who are people who are wise. Absolutely. But when you need to do what you need to do, do it. And remember always where we come from. Remember also that people are fallible. There's a very interesting lesson to be learned from what happened after the Talmud was finished. About 500 years later, we come across one of the greatest people in our history as well, who was known as Maimonides, the Rambam. The Rambam wrote the Mishnah Torah, which is 14 volumes of the law. And he wrote in his introduction that with this sefer that I've just completed, with what I've just written here, you don't need anything else. You'll never need anything else. This is all you need. It'll have everything in it. So HaKadosh Baruch Hu paid him back. He says, okay, he's one of the great people in our history, right? But what did God do? There is probably no other book, no other sefer in Judaism that has more commentators that have written on it than the Rambam, right? So he got paid back for saying you don't need anything else. But the fact of the matter is we have to look at that. We have to look back, see what was done, whether it's Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi or others, learn from them and learn from their mistakes, and learn from the fact that when they made mistakes, they would be willing to say so that we could learn from them. But most importantly, understand who you are, understand what it means to be a Jew, understand what our role in this world is, and what the ultimate destiny of the Jewish people is.
Beautiful. Morty, thank you so much for sharing your wisdom with us on this very important topic. And I'm looking forward to the next episode in this series so we can continue to learn from our sages.
Okay, I thank you. I will ask you for one other thing, if I might, which
Sure.
you can include or not include, but I'm going to read to you something. One of the things that we did not discuss because we only have so much time, right? But one of the items that is interesting about Judaism is the various pieces of Judaism that are discussed in the Talmud. And among them is something called gematria. It's in the Ethics of the Fathers. It's at the end of chapter 3 where we are told, and I'll read you, Ethics of the Fathers says, the last Mishnah of chapter 3. It says, Rabbi Eliezer ben Chisma said, the laws about the sacrifices of birds and the ritual purification of women are essential ordinances, as well as astronomy, geometry are the minor side dishes of wisdom. Geometry has come down to us to be translated as gematria or numerologies. So numerology in its simplest form, we're very familiar with. Probably the most famous word that we have with gematria. Gematria very simply means assigning a numerical value to every letter in the Hebrew alphabet, both the regular standard aleph base and then the additional letters which come at the end of words. Each one of these has a different value, starting with aleph is 1, bet is 2, and so forth, all the way down to the highest number, which is about 900, based on which letter it is. Okay. The most famous gematria of our time is probably chai. The word life in Hebrew is 18. So, and that's found its way into the culture. And when people give charity, they'll sometimes give a multiple of chai or what have you. So it's kind of a levity, a moment of levity, but I'll read you something that is very interesting based on gematria. There is a fellow who wrote a book that is called, I came across it a number of years ago, it's called A Book of Jewish Curiosities. It was written by a fellow named David Hausdorff, and it was published by Crown Publishers in 1955. The very last chapter of his book deals with gematria, with this numerology. Let me read to you word for word what he says here. There is one school of thought which asserts that everything that has occurred or will occur is contained in the Bible. A follower of that doctrine was once jocularly asked where prohibition in the United States of America is mentioned. In less than a minute, this expert replied, verse 9 of the 10th chapter of Leviticus, Sefer Vayikra, and where it says the following, quote, drink no wine or strong drink, end quote. When it was pointed out to him that this could easily apply to any country in any epoch, he showed that the final letters of these 4 Hebrew words of drink no wine or strong drink, which is yayin v'shecher al tesht, in other words, wine and drink no wine, that is a strong drink. The last letters are nun, which is 50, v'shecher, which is reish, that's 200, al, which is a lamed, that's 30, and tesht, which is a tuf, so that is 400. Altogether, that comes to 680, a value of 680. And that it was in the year 680 of the 5th millennium, 5,680 of the Hebrew year 5680, corresponding to 1920, the year that the Volstead Act of Prohibition was passed. So it's kind of a joke, but the fact of the matter is that gematria plays a vital role. It's one of those things that you can have fun with, and people use it for their names and for other things to learn out certain things. One of the things, last thing that I will mention in closing is to remind people that if they wish to have some kind of a bibliography, I'm happy to send it. And one of those that will be included in the bibliography is one we didn't get to, which I wanted to, but I'm just going to allude to it, is a book by a very famous author, a novelist by the name of Herman Wouk, W-O-U-K. He wrote The Cain Mutiny, among other things. He's a very famous author, and he was a religious man, and he grew up in the Bronx. His grandfather came from Europe before the war, back in the late 19th century, early 20th century, and he learned Gemara with his grandfather.
And I didn't know he was Jewish.
He was Jewish. Herman Wouk was Jewish, a religious Jew. By the way, for a good number of years towards the end of his life, he lived in the Caribbean, and he had Chabad send down kosher meat to him. He was very close to Chabad. In any case, one of the books he wrote was something called This Is My God. Are you familiar with that?
No.
Called This Is My God. Very worth picking up. You can pick it up in the library. There are a number of different editions of it, but he wrote it. And in that book of This Is My God, he gives one of the most elegant descriptions and definitions of what the Talmud is. And I would recommend everyone to do that, to read the book generally, but specifically, if you're interested in this topic, read what he says about the Talmud. It's just beautiful.
Thank you, Morty.
All right, you're welcome. Great pleasure. Be well.
Thank you for listening, and if you enjoyed the episode and found it meaningful, please take a moment to rate, review, and share the podcast.